Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our presentation. I'm Lucas here with Team 5, and joining me, we got Sherry, Christian, Darren, and Brody. Today, we are going to talk about selection and assessment in the workplace, which is just a fancy way of saying hiring and performance evaluation. So in this next 20 minutes, we're going to identify the value of successful recruitment methods, talk about the difference between selection and recruitment, discuss the selection process. We're going to compare different training techniques, and we're going to identify cognitive biases in the workplace, identify different methods of performance evaluation, and then we're going to talk about the leadership role of human resources. And to kick us off, I'm going to send it over to Sherry.
All right, so to start this presentation, I want to make sure we all know the differences between recruitment and selection. So recruitment is going to be the first step before the whole selection process can happen. The objective and process of recruiting is to encourage candidates to apply to the specific organization or company. To do that, there are different methods recruiters can use. After that process, that is when the company or organization moves forward with going through with the whole process of selecting the best candidate fit for them. The differences between these two is that recruiting is a positive process as it attracts people towards the organization, when selection is a positive, but more so a negative process as it involves rejection. All right, so moving on. To start the whole recruiting process, it's extremely important to have the right person as a recruiter. I know Professor Michael can probably agree with this because I know he's been a recruiter for many years himself. So you really want to make sure the person recruiting has all of the knowledge of the organization so that they can find the appropriate candidate. So here we have the two types of methods in recruiting. There's internal sourcing, which is hiring from within the company, and there's external sourcing where it's hiring outside the company, which can be something like media advertisement and employment agencies. So the pros of recruiting internally is that it's extremely cheap and a time saver compared to externally, where it's more costly and a time-consuming process. The pros of recruiting externally is that you can get a fresh approach and it brings in new ideas that can benefit the company. The concept of doing it internally is that because it's not bringing in a fresh approach, there's a risk of preventing new ideas and diversity. So giving these pros and cons, if you guys want to go ahead and comment in the chat, I would love to know which one of these two methods you would rather do if you were a recruiter yourself. All right, moving on to the importance of selection. So the importance of selection is so that it helps chooses the most suitable candidate who can meet the requirements of the job in the organization. So by doing so, it helps increase the overall performance of the organization, but a risk that can come with selection is that if the selection is wrong, the cost incurred in induction and training could be a loss to the employer in terms of time, money, and effort. All right, so moving on, I'm going to go ahead and go over the selection process that a company and organization goes through to select someone to be on their team. So to start off, so after they receive their recruitment, the applicant starts by applying to the job. And after that, they start with the initial selection. In this step, they use initial selection for preliminary rough cuts to help decide whether the applicant meets the basic qualifications for a job. So examples in this step can be application forms and background checks. If in this case, the applicant doesn't meet the basic qualifications, they are then rejected. If they do, they move forward with the substantive selection process. So in this substantive selection step, they determine the most qualified applicants by doing written tests, performance tests, and interviews. And if the applicant is among best qualified, they move forward. If the applicant are less qualified than others, they are then rejected. So now they're in the most important step, which is contingent selection. And in this step, they make the final checks before making the offer to the applicant. For example, they can do extra testing like drug testing and medical exams to make sure they are qualified for the job. And then after that, the applicant receives the job offer. And by using this whole process, it eliminates those not qualified easier and makes the hiring process more effective. All right. So how can we share we're selecting the right people for our team? I'm going to go ahead and tell you that you can never be sure if you've selected the right people for your team, but something that you can do is make the effort into selecting an effective team. So something that you can do, you should consider is the context, team composition, and team process factors. So context will determine team performance, while team composition includes how the team should be staffed, and how the team processes is extremely important in larger groups, since you want to make sure the process gains exceeds their process losses. So by putting these important aspects into consideration, it will.
All right, for my section, I will be discussing what the law has to say about fairness in the workplace. One of the main benefits of maintaining fairness in the workplace is to avoid and manage conflict. Conflict in the workplace can increase absenteeism and decrease productivity. Workers who perceive their work environment as unfair will develop toxic working relationships over time and may become distrustful of managers and even lash out at coworkers who they perceive as a threat. Conflicts like these could lead to allegations of creating a hostile work environment in which the resolution could prove extremely costly. The following are a list of federal laws created to protect the fairness of employees and applicants in the workplace. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits employers from discriminating in the hiring process based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The law also requires that employers reasonably accommodate applicants and employees' sincerely held religious practices, unless doing so would impose an undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act, this law amended Title VII to make it illegal to discriminate against a woman because of pregnancy, childbirth, or medical condition related to pregnancy or childbirth. The Fair Labor Standards Act provides regulation as to the duration of workdays and breaks an employer must provide. It governs applicable salary and overtime requirements set out by the federal government. The Equal Pay Act of 1963 amends the Fair Labor Standards Act by prohibiting sex-based wage discrimination between men and women in the same establishment who perform jobs that require substantially equal skill, effort, and responsibility under similar working conditions. Family and Medical Leave Act provides that employers must allow employees to take up to 12 weeks leave of absence for qualified medical purposes. It stipulates that to qualify for the leave, the employee must have worked for the employer for 12 months and for 1,250 hours preceding the leave, and maintains that qualified employees' positions are preserved for the duration of the leave. The Americans with Disabilities Act provides that if an individual with a disability can perform essential functions with or without reasonable accommodation, that person can't be discriminated against on the basis of their disability. This applies in both the private sector and in state and local governments. The law also requires that employers reasonably accommodate the known physical or mental limitations of an otherwise qualified individual with a disability who is an applicant or employee, unless doing so would impose an undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. Disability is defined as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act prevents employers from giving preferential treatment to younger workers to the detriment of older workers. This only applies to workers 40 years of age and older, and to workplaces with 20 or more employees. It doesn't, however, prevent an employer from favoring older employees over younger employees. All the federal laws detailed here make it illegal to retaliate against a person because the person complained about discrimination, filed a charge of discrimination, or participated in an employment discrimination investigation or lawsuit, thus protecting the individuals who feel their rights are being denied while they are seeking justice. This concludes my discussion on the major federal laws that impact fairness in the workplace. Next, Lucas will be discussing how cognitive biases get in the way of selection.
Thank you, Christian, for that. So now we are going to talk about how cognitive biases get in the way of selection. And I would like you to consider this quote by famed psychology professor Andrew Lieberman. Unconscious cognition is essential to human functioning. It helps us be proficient and responsive to the world around us. However, unconscious processes are also prone to errors. Errors that, if remain unrecognized and uncorrected, can lead to flawed decision-making, significant bias, and blinkered thinking. So what are cognitive biases? Cognitive biases are predictable patterns of thoughts and behaviors that lead us to draw incorrect conclusions, and really they are unavoidable. We do this instinctively. This is a biological trait that we all have, and scientists believe they are a relic of evolution. We do this without even knowing. So how does this affect the workplace? In the workplace, unconscious biases can manifest within business processes like selection and hiring and performance reviews, leading decision makers to unfairly advantage some whilst disadvantaging others. So this is where some people get promoted and some people don't, just because off of some biases the upper management might have or something like that. Biases influence how we view ourselves, how we view others, and how we manage our teams. So in this next slide, we're going to talk about a couple of biases we see in the workplace. The most common types of biases we'll see are the self-enhancement bias. This leads us to thinking that we are better than we actually are. We give ourselves more credit than anybody else would. If you can think of if I asked you the question, do you have good common sense? You would think, well, of course I have good common sense. If I asked this to anybody, they probably think they have good common sense. We think ourselves is better than probably anybody else. And the confirmation bias, it stops us from looking at the whole picture as we filter out information and focus on facts that back up our own perceptions around people and events. This is where we look for things that we already know that agree with our thinking to confirm with us. This is why we like people who think like us, is because they'll agree with us and they see things how we see it, even though there might be more to it than there is. One we've seen in class before is the fundamental attribution error. It is the tendency to blame others when things go wrong instead of objectively looking at the situation. The next one we have is the negativity bias. This is where people tend to pay more attention to and give weight to negative experiences and information rather than the positives. This is where you have your pessimists. It can lead to unnecessary risk aversion. In business, risk is very important. It's the difference between $1 million of profit and $10,000 in profit. You got to risk it to get the biscuit in the business world. This next one we have is the recency bias. This so we give more weight to the more recent events that have happened instead of what is happening in the past. If you at work and you make a mistake that you've never made before, and all of a sudden you get corrected about it, or your managers bring it up on your performance review, it's just because it happened the most recent. They disregarded everything you have done in the past. That's the recency bias. And this last one we have, pretty common, it's the halo/horn effect. This is when our overall impression of someone influences our feelings about their character. This is when we put people on a pedestal. If that's the halo effect, this is where we like them so much and they can do no wrong. And then the horn effect on the flip side is this where we already have this negative impression about somebody and really nothing they could do can fix that impression. So how can we outsmart our workplace biases? First thing we could do, and is a pretty common thing, is a 360-degree feedback survey. This is a survey from peers and other leaders in the workplace that give insights on the performance which the manager is unable to see. I do this at work at Fred Meyer. This is a pretty common thing that we do. We review all our managers and managers above them to see how they do, and they don't see these. Another thing we could do is be aware of the biases we have created. We can just ask ourselves, if we were meeting this person for the first time, would we think differently about them? And I think that's a pretty important thing to do because perceptions change over time. I think it's important to go back and look at new perceptions. You might ask for feedback about biases you might be demonstrating. An important thing if you do that is to remember to be open to criticism and anything else a person you might have to say, and just be open for any type of growth. The key is conscious awareness and practices to outsmart workplace biases. And now I'm going to pass it over to Brody to talk about performance measurement.
Productivity amongst the workplace. First, we can help management make informed decisions about future promotions, job transfers, and even terminations. In doing so, we will simultaneously target areas that need to be worked on. Some of these potential focus areas may be workplace attitude or counterproduction, for example. On the other hand, measuring performance will also allow us to highlight employees' strengths and skills within their job. Another great benefit to measuring performance is both the employer and the employee will be on the same page, or at least in communication about what needs to be maintained as well as improved. Lastly, like most circumstances in which you're being judged on your performance, there's room for potential rewards. So if you, the employee, demonstrates behavior that is congruent with or exceeds your employer's workplace expectations. Next, within performance evaluation, there are three main categories that are observed: task performance, citizenship, and counterproductivity. An example of task performance would be your responsibilities and duties within your outlined job description. In other words, if you are a chef at a restaurant, you would be graded on your ability to prepare the dishes correctly and in a timely manner. An example of citizenship would be actions that contribute to the overall psychological environment within your workplace. So, some of these would be supporting company objectives, constructive suggestions, and implementing positivity. On the other hand, actions such as speaking negatively or being a social loafer would regret in a lower citizenship score. This leads into counterproductivity as well, which is any behavior that may harm the organization, from stealing to excessive absences. This type of behavior would be noted and communicated during a performance review. This type of behavior could also potentially lead to a demotion or termination, depending on the severity. Some of you may be thinking, how do we actually measure these categories on a scale that isn't biased or swayed depending on the management or their principles? Also considering that each organization is going to not only use different tests suited to how they run their organization, but to whichever one they deem to be the most effective. So this most simple one is written essays. This type of test, however, does not come with a standardized key because it's basically an open response. Next, we have critical incidents. This type of evaluation cites only specific behavior that occurs within the workplace that is deemed effective or ineffective. Next, we have the most common, which is graphic rating scales. These basically are pretty simple. For example, a 1 would be deemed as poorly informed about work duties, and on the opposite, a 5 being complete mastery of all job phases. Next, we have BARS, behaviorally anchored rating scales. These take some similarities from other approaches, and it's basically reliant on varying quality levels. Lastly, in my opinion, what I see as the most cutthroat type of performance measurement comes in the form of force comparisons. Essentially, it is where employees are measured relative to how their coworkers perform. The most common forms within this type are group order ranking and individual ranking. With that being said, I think I'm going to hand it off to Darren, who will discuss what an actual effective performance management process looks like.
The first step to an effective performance management process is training and development. I'm pretty sure when all you guys got your first jobs, you guys had to go through some sort of training and development for however long it took before you guys could actually take the field and work. There are many methods of training, and there's a lot of different skills that one can learn, so I'm going to go over a few. Basic skills are basically, can you read, can you write, can you add, or can you subtract, simple things. Technical skills are technology based, basically having to do with computers. How fast can you type? Can you browse the internet? Are you good with computers? Things like that. Problem solving skills, this has to do with logistics, coordination, and analyzing alternatives. This has to do with how good are you at comprehending the problem and how good are you at finding alternate solutions to the problem. Interpersonal skills are basically communication skills. Can we train you to communicate with a team, or do you prefer working by yourself? How good are you working with management? Stuff like that. Ethics training, I put an asterisk next to that because honestly, I never received ethics training, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people haven't. I asked my mom and stuff. They don't ever receive ethics training. Most people go to work and they get paid right or wrong. It doesn't really matter what the company is doing as long as they're getting paid. So I put ethics training with asterisks on it. When we take a look at the process, we have to look at the HR department or the human resources department. This is the department that's responsible for managing the people, employees, or the humans. This is the department that's responsible for the front lines of all employment conditions, ranging from termination to layoffs to benefits, which we'll talk about later in the slides. Another job of the HR department is to inform employees about policies and practices. They have to lay down the groundwork of what employees can and can't do and what they can and can't get away with. Another thing they do is motivation versus exploitation. As a worker, you don't want to feel like you're being exploited for your hard labor. You want to go to work motivated to produce the most. So if there's like a bad bridge between the HR department and their employees, it's not going to end well for the company. But the main topic I want to take out of this is the HPWS, or the high performance work system. These are practices that work together to help improve organizational outcomes and goals. These practices increase work engagement and performances of all employees. They develop profit sharing programs, which are more common in high-end corporations like Apple, which do like stock dividends and like stock splits at the end of the year. So that's what profit sharing programs are. We're not really going to talk about that though. The HPWS is also responsible for practices that improve the learning culture and improve productivity, because at the end of the day, no company is going to want a lazy employee. If you're lazy, you're probably getting fired and you're probably not making profits. So the HR department is responsible for keeping that accountable. When we ask what the process looks like, we have to look at the systems and the practices. The first one we look at are benefit programs. What are the benefits of working for us? Is it because we offer superior healthcare, or is it because our retirement plans are better? Each benefit program has to suit the organization's goals and reflects its values. They also have to be sustainable. Is this a long-term benefit, or is this a short-term benefit? The second one we look at are employment policies. What should one expect when they come to work for us? What rules are laid out for them? And what can or can't they do when they come to work for us? Number 3 is work-life conflicts. This is the balance between your work and your life. What is our company doing better than the next in terms of work-life balance? Are we offering better scheduling and flex time, or are we offering better vacation and paid time off? Those are some things to think about in work-life conflicts. Another one is mental health. Is our job straining your mental health or straining your physical health, or is it upping your mental health and your physical health? Those are some other things to think about in work-life conflicts. The fourth one we talk about are mediations, termination, and layoffs. As an HR manager, having a balanced and professional perspective when you're firing or laying somebody off is going to do well for the company. Because if you're fair and favorable, you're going to have good impressions for future employees, basically, who are applying for a job. However, if you're going to be mean about your termination, or if you're going to lay somebody off in an unprofessional way, they're probably going to leave a bad review off your job, and then you guys are going to have a bad image under your company. In terms of the performance management process, the last thing I want to touch on is implications for managers and organization strategy. For an organization, you got to have a long-term plan. As a CEO, you got to ask yourself, like, what are the goals for my employees long-term in terms of performance and productivity? One solution is to pay for performance compensation. You guys know this as like bonuses and like goals, employees a month. I put 2 stars next to that, not because it's important, but because it's debatable. Some people think this leads to corruption within the company, and some people think it leads to better employee performance. I guess it's just really how you see it. Resources is in caps because that's probably the best thing a company can do is invest in resources. This is gonna up your employee productivity and up your performance if they have more resources. For managers, giving employees the opportunity for evaluation is important. Being on an employee's ass 24/7 really isn't gonna give them room for growth. Performance tracking and assessment. I put Finish Line under there as you guys can see because at Finish Line every month we had a performance tracking and assessment test that was hidden that we didn't even know about. The managers would basically test us on customer service and see how we were handling our products, if we're taking care of our shoes and stuff like that. So I think that's important for performance management. The last one is team development. As a manager, you got to develop your employees like basically as a team. I feel like if people work better in teams and if people are working alone, they're not really going to develop good productivity. Working in teams is going to make things better and it's going to make things faster. So those are some points that I had for implications for managers and organization strategy.